Born as Norma Jeane Mortensen, the story of Marilyn Monroe begins long before her birth, marked by the complex reality of her mother, Gladys Pearl Baker. Years before the birth of the future star, Gladys formed a family with John Newton Baker, with whom she had 2 children, Robert and Bernice. However, after a bitter separation in 1923, the father took both children away to Kentucky without her consent. This event left Gladys emotionally broken and with a mental fragility that she would carry for the rest of her life. In 1925, while working as a film negative cutter at Consolidated Film Industries, Gladys had an affair with a coworker named Charles Stanley Gifford. From that relationship, Norma Jeane was born on June 1, 1926. Throughout her life, the identity of her biological father remained a great mystery. Her mother, Gladys, struggled with a very delicate mental health condition. Gladys tried to raise Norma Jeane during the first months, but as a single mother facing economic and psychological difficulties, she decided to entrust the baby's care to a foster family when she was barely 2 weeks old. Despite the distance from her mother, Norma Jeane's early childhood was calm, stable, and happy. Gladys left her daughter under the guardianship of Albert and Ida Bollender, a couple with very firm values who practiced evangelical Christianity. The Bollenders cared for her until she turned 7. They were religious, strict people, but they provided her with a stability she would rarely find again. Gladys used to travel from Hollywood on weekends to see her daughter during the 7 years the girl lived with the Bollenders in Hawthorne, California. These visits were regular, and Gladys tried to spend as much time as possible with her. Ida Bollender wanted to adopt the girl, but Gladys flatly refused, insisting on her right as mother. In 1933, when little Norma was only 6 years old, Gladys finally managed to acquire a home of her own and was able to take her daughter with her. When Gladys took Norma Jeane from the Bollenders' house, there was much tension and resentment in that farewell. After so much time, they would finally have the family they had always longed for. But that period of calm lasted very little. In January 1934, the situation at home became unbearable. Gladys went through a very critical episode of emotional health, which was diagnosed as paranoid schizophrenia, and due to the complexity of her condition, she had to be transferred to a specialized center to receive long-term professional care. Marilyn forever kept the memory of that moment when her mother was taken from home against her will, an image that marked her deeply and generated for years a great unease about her own future stability. When Gladys was institutionalized, she was no longer in charge of her decisions, but before losing her reason completely, she had designated her best friend, Grace McKee, as her proxy and guardian of her daughter's affairs. Gladys trusted Grace blindly because they worked together in the film industry. For Gladys, the Bollenders were strangers she had paid for a service, while Grace was her chosen family. After her mother's departure, Norma Jeane was placed under the supervision of the authorities, but her custody officially passed into the hands of Grace McKee. Grace, who already acted as a modern and close aunt, assumed full control. For the state, since there was a close person with a stable job and willing to take care of the girl, it was not necessary to contact her former caregivers in Hawthorne, the Bollenders, again. Although the Bollenders felt great affection for Norma, they were registered caregivers under the system. In contrast, Grace had a good salary in the film industry and assured that she could cover all of the girl's expenses on her own. This made it easier for the authorities to grant her permanent custody. Norma Jeane did not return to the Bollenders because Grace McKee had a different plan for her. One that included lights, cameras, and glamour, something the conservative Bollenders would never have allowed. Grace McKee had an obsession: she wanted Norma Jeane to become a movie star. The Bollenders were very conservative evangelical Christians who saw cinema as sinful or worldly. Grace felt that if the girl went back to the Bollenders, her potential as the next Jean Harlow would be wasted in a life of farming and religion. Grace wanted to keep the child close to Hollywood to mold her in her own image. Ironically, it was that very ambition of Grace that ended up sending Marilyn to the orphanage when the money ran out. Grace McKee was not a movie villain, but rather a woman obsessed with Hollywood glamour who was overwhelmed by economic reality and family pressures. When Gladys was institutionalized, Grace eagerly assumed custody. She not only cared for Norma Jeane, but also saw her as a project. Grace worked in the film industry, cutting negatives, and projected onto the girl her own desires for fame. At that moment, things seemed to be going well, but stability was only an illusion. Gladys had bought a house before falling ill, but once she was declared legally incompetent, her assets were frozen by the state. Grace could not keep up with the payments on Gladys's house and had to move with Norma Jeane into a smaller home. Soon after, Grace married Irvin "Doc" Goddard, who already had 3 children. Suddenly, Grace's budget was no longer enough to support such a large family while also covering the medical expenses of her friend Gladys. To survive the years of the Great Depression, the Goddards made a common decision of the time: renting out rooms. This is how George Atkinson entered the picture. He was not just a tenant, he was a vital source of income that allowed the family to keep their home. However, when Norma Jeane was only 8 years old, she experienced one of the most difficult episodes of her childhood in the very place where she was supposed to feel safest. Taking advantage of the trust he had been given, this man betrayed the little girl's innocence, crossing boundaries that would mark her life forever. The true pain did not end there, but with the reaction of those around her. When Norma Jeane sought refuge in Grace and confided what had happened, she encountered a wall of disbelief. Perhaps out of fear of losing the money the tenant provided, or out of deep denial, her guardian downplayed her words. Grace was in a desperate position. If she confronted the situation, she would lose her financial support. If she listened to the child, she would have to face a reality for which she was not emotionally prepared. Meanwhile, Doc Goddard was not enthusiastic about raising another person's child, especially with scarce resources. Norma Jeane's presence became a constant source of friction in the marriage. After this unfortunate event, the atmosphere at home became unbearable. Grace, instead of acting firmly against the perpetrator, sought a way to distance the girl from the conflict in an attempt to ease the tension and the economic burden they felt at that time. This forced silence and the lack of protection from her only maternal figure were the breaking point. Shortly after what had happened, instead of removing the person who had caused the harm, Grace concluded that she could no longer take care of the child, sending her to the Hollygrove orphanage. At that moment, Marilyn understood, at a very young age, that the adult world could be indifferent to the fragility of the little ones. Just a few months after those incidents, Grace decided the situation had overwhelmed her. The official reasons pointed to a lack of resources and emotional exhaustion. Grace convinced the authorities, and tried to convince herself, that the motives were purely financial. Although there was an emotional bond, her marriage to Doc Goddard ultimately tipped the balance. Doc had no interest in integrating Norma Jeane into his family dynamic, especially when resources were scarce. Thus, in September 1935, at only 9 years old, the decision was made to place her in the Hollygrove orphanage, then called the Los Angeles Orphans' Home Society. Her arrival at the Hollygrove orphanage on September 13, 1935, was marked as one of the saddest moments of her story. Grace McKee did not tell her the truth. She told her they were going for a ride, but when they stopped in front of the massive brick building, Norma Jeane understood what was happening. Marilyn remembered crying and screaming, "I'm not an orphan, my mother isn't dead." Her new identity, upon entering, she ceased to be Norma Jeane and became number 3463. Marilyn would say,
"In the orphanage you are not a child. You are a cost. You are number 3463 in an accounting book."
She felt that this number was proof that she did not belong to anyone, but to the state. She never forgot it, because it represented the moment when she stopped being a daughter and became a statistic. Her stay in the orphanage lasted 21 months. The most contradictory thing was that Grace kept visiting her and taking her to the movies, but then left her back at the institution while she continued her life with her husband, and at times with the same tenant who had caused the crisis. In the end, the family and economic structure was prioritized over the child's emotional stability. Grace's decision was not due to a lack of affection, but rather a mix of cowardice and financial desperation. She chose the tenant's money and the stability of her marriage over the girl's safety. By sending her to the orphanage, Grace not only rid herself of an expense, but also of the guilt of having to look into the eyes of the child she had failed to protect. For her part, Norma Jeane lived in constant waiting. Her favorite activity was sitting by a window that faced the street. She would spend hours watching, with the illusion of seeing her mother's car or Grace's car appear to take her back. It was in this place that a deep sense of loneliness was born. Marilyn mentioned that, although her mother was present in this world, the emptiness she felt was even stronger than that of those who had no one. It was the weight of knowing her family existed, but she could not be with them. At the public school she attended, Vine Street School, the children from the orphanage were called home kids. They had to wear uniform clothing that screamed their condition of abandonment. Marilyn remembered walking with her head down so no one would notice her cheap clothes. She felt invisible. Years later she wrote, "Nobody spoke to me, nobody touched me. It was as if I didn't exist." Life in that place was ruled by very strict discipline and constant chores. Her main task was washing the dishes of hundreds of classmates, a job for which she received only a few cents. However, with that small savings, she sought her own moments of joy. She would buy ribbons for her hair or save the money to go to the movies on weekends when she was allowed. Those coins were, in reality, her ticket to a small dose of freedom and dreams before the big screen. Those who cared for her at the center described her as an extremely reserved, calm, and withdrawn child. She did not seek to stand out in class or in sports. She was a girl who tried to go unnoticed, perhaps as a way of avoiding any kind of conflict or reprimand. For her classmates, she was simply another member of the group. Without close friendships, Norma Jeane constantly took refuge in her own world of fantasy. However, toward the end of her stay, around the age of 11, her presence began to attract attention involuntarily, something that sometimes brought her complications in an environment governed by extremely strict and conservative rules. This stage of homelessness and instability was not just a passing chapter. It was the mold that sculpted her personality, leaving deep marks that would always accompany her in her adult life. First of all, a persistent stutter emerged, a physical manifestation of the insecurity and fear she felt when moving from one strange environment to another. It was as if her own voice, conditioned by difficult experiences, doubted her right to be heard. At the same time, having grown up under public guardianship and passed through different homes, she developed an unrelenting search for affection. This need for approval became the driving force of her existence. For her, public recognition was not a matter of ego, but proof that she was truly valued and accepted by the world. And finally, cinema became her absolute refuge. The Hollygrove Orphanage was located at a strategic point from which the glow of the great studios could be seen. Marilyn recalled that from the orphanage window she could see the luminous sign of the Archaeopentagus Theater. For her, those lights were not just decoration, they were the signal of a world where things ended well. She would spend hours gazing in that direction, imagining that one day she would be behind those lights, where no one could hurt her. When Grace McKee took her out of the orphanage on weekends, their main activity was going to the movies. Grace would give her a few cents and leave her in the cinema for hours while she ran errands. Sometimes Marilyn stayed to watch the same film 2 or 3 times in a row. In the darkness of the theater, Norma Jeane found a peace that did not exist outside. In her own words,
"No one asked me to do anything. No one yelled at me, and the characters on the screen never left."
The cinema was the only space where she stopped being a child under custody and became someone free. Grace McKee was the one who planted in her the spark of acting, constantly comparing her to the great star of the time, Jean Harlow. It is said that Grace even allowed her to wear a little makeup and fixed her hair before entering the theater, telling her, "Look at yourself, you're just like Jean Harlow." It was then that Norma Jeane began to study the movements and the way of speaking of the actresses she admired. The cinema ceased to be only a refuge and became her great rehearsal stage. She no longer wanted to inhabit the reality of the girl who had endured so many hardships, she longed to embody the confidence of the women she saw on the big screen. Years later, already transformed into the icon the world would acclaim, she summed up this period with a phrase that still resonates powerfully today.
I liked the darkness of the cinema. It was a place where I could be alone and, at the same time, be accompanied by everyone. The cinema was my only homeland.
During this period, her obsession with visual perfection was born. She learned that the camera could love her in a way real people did not. The cinema became her substitute mother, the one that taught her how to smile, how to dress, and, ultimately, how to become the myth the world came to know. Despite having left her there, Grace always felt a mixture of guilt and affection for Norma Jeane. She never stopped visiting her, although not as often as the girl needed. In 1937, Grace finally managed to stabilize her financial situation a bit more after marrying Irvin "Doc" Goddard, and decided it was time to take the girl out of the institution. To remove a child from a state orphanage at that time, the guardian had to prove they had a stable home and the means to support them. Grace presented the necessary documentation to regain physical custody of Norma Jeane. Her goal was for the girl to live with her again, but this is where the story became complicated once more. Although she succeeded in taking her out of the center, her husband still refused to accept the idea of integrating Norma Jeane permanently into their home. This meant that, despite having regained her freedom, the girl did not find a stable place. Grace began moving her among different relatives and acquaintances, searching for a place where she might fit in. Failing to achieve harmonious coexistence in her marital home, Norma Jeane was sent to live with various foster families. It was a period of constant rotation and neglect. Years later, Marilyn would confide to those close to her that in several of those homes she experienced extremely difficult and inappropriate situations at the hands of those who were supposed to care for her. Lacking a solid family nucleus to support her, she found herself in a position of total defenselessness. Unfortunately, within that foster system, her fragility exposed her to people who took advantage of her lack of protection, turning her childhood into a path filled with risks and unjust situations. When life in the temporary homes became unsustainable, Grace could not find a safe place for her. It was then that she finally sent her to Anna Lower. The stay with Anna Lower, whom Marilyn affectionately called Aunt Anna, was probably the only period of her childhood when Norma Jeane truly knew what it meant to have a real home, full of affection and free of fears. Anna was Grace McKee's aunt, a kind woman with great inner peace. When Norma Jeane arrived at her house in 1938, after the instability of the previous years, she finally found an environment of absolute calm. Marilyn would confess years later,
Anna was the first person in the world whom I truly loved and who loved me back.
With her, Norma Jeane ceased to be a state file and became, simply, a child again. Anna was a devoted follower of Christian Science. This religion had a tremendous impact on the future Marilyn. Anna taught her that pain and illness could be overcome through positive thinking and faith. A key point was Anna's support with Norma Jeane's stuttering. She gave her the confidence she needed to express herself without fear. In fact, many believe that Marilyn's characteristic soft, whispered tone of voice was born during those moments of seeking serenity alongside Anna. At Anna's home, Norma Jeane lived like an ordinary teenager of the time. She attended junior high school, Emerson Jr., without the shame of being a child from the orphanage. Anna cared for her, listened to her, and, most importantly, made sure that no one disturbed her peace. It was a space of absolute respect, where her mind and well-being could finally rest. Unfortunately, this refuge was not permanent. By the end of 1940, Aunt Anna's health began to weaken due to heart complications. The house, once a place of laughter and lessons in trust, became filled with doctors and silence. Anna no longer had the energy to look after a 14-year-old girl at a time when Norma Jeane was beginning to attract too much attention from the outside world. Marilyn would later recount that she tried to be invisible and make no noise in the house, so as not to tire Anna's heart. But the decision of the doctors and of Grace McKee was final. The girl had to move so that Anna could rest. The farewell was heartbreaking. Norma Jeane had to pack her few belongings and leave the home on Nebraska Street in West Los Angeles to move in with Grace and Doc Goddard in Van Nuys. For her, crossing that door was like leaving behind a sanctuary. She knew she was returning to an environment where she was not truly welcome by Grace's husband, and where her peace was once again in doubt. The farewell to Aunt Anna was not just a move, it was the end of a period of peace. By closing the door of that house, she left behind the only person who had looked at her with eyes of unconditional acceptance. She departed carrying a small suitcase and a great uncertainty, knowing that the refuge was over and that, from that moment on, she would have to learn to fend for herself in a world that had already proven to be very cruel. It was in this scenario of uncertainty where a decision was born that would change her life forever. Faced with the fear of returning to the system that had hurt her so deeply, Norma Jeane accepted an unexpected path, a commitment that promised stability but, in reality, would be the first step toward a radical transformation. But this story, I want to tell you in an upcoming video. Norma Jeane's childhood was not just a series of moves and farewells. It was a constant battle to preserve her identity in a world that tried to turn her into a number. When she entered that brick building in 1935, the system assigned her the number 3463, attempting to convince her that she was nothing more than an expense in an accounting book. Just another statistic among thousands. There was something that institutions and the decisions of others could never touch. Her ability to dream. Marilyn's life teaches us that, often, we are the result of decisions made by others. The fragility of a mother, the ambition of a guardian, or the coldness of a system. Norma Jeane lived at the mercy of other people's wills, but in the darkness of those movie theaters, she made her own choice. She decided that her reality would not be her destiny. She chose to believe that if she could learn to smile like the actresses on the screen, the pain of the past could not reach her. That obsession with glamour was not vanity, it was her armor. Marilyn Monroe was the creation of a little girl who needed to be invincible in order to survive. If today you find yourself at a moment in your life where you feel invisible, where you feel like just another number, or that circumstances have left you in a vulnerable position, remember the window at Hollygrove. Your origin does not define your destiny. Norma Jeane began in the smallest room, washing dishes for pennies, and feeling the emptiness of abandonment. But none of that stopped her from becoming an eternal icon. Your worth is intrinsic. Just as Aunt Anna taught her, your life has immense value simply because you exist, regardless of who is there to see it or who has chosen to leave. Turn your refuge into your engine. Marilyn found in cinema her only homeland. Find that which makes you feel safe, whether it is art, knowledge, or a dream, and use it as the fuel to build the life you desire. The story of Marilyn Monroe is, above all, a story of resilience. It shows us that even when the world turns its back on us and forces us to walk with our heads down, within us remains a light that no one can confiscate. She survived the shadows to live under the spotlight, reminding us that no matter how dark the path may be, there is always a bright sign waiting for us, if we have the courage to keep looking toward the window.